We're going to try to stick to our agenda and hear next from Jim Leahy. He is from the State University of New York at Buffalo, or they call it SUNY Buffalo. Mr. Leahy is a fellow NIDOR grantee. He is from the Knowledge Translation Center for Technology Transfer, which we fondly refer to as KT4TT. And he's going to spend the next 30 minutes with us talking about translating research findings for uptake and use by various stakeholders. You with us, Jim?
Yes, I am, Kathleen. Thank you.
Sure.
Good afternoon, everyone. As Kathleen mentioned, I am with the KT4TT Center at the University at Buffalo. The title of my presentation today is Translating Research Findings for Uptake and Use by Various Stakeholders. From time to time over the last few years, our center has worked with NIDOR grantees to translate their research findings for uptake and use by others. Examples of those efforts and other resources and examples of knowledge translation can be found on our website, and I will mention more about that later in my presentation. But first, our acknowledgement to our sponsor. Contents of this presentation were developed under a grant from NIDOR. NIDOR is a center, of course, within ACL at the Department of Health and Human Services, and the contents of this presentation do not necessarily represent the policy of NIDOR, ACL, HHS, and you should not assume endorsement by the federal government. Background, translation of research findings. First, I guess a little background information. We have found that academic researchers historically have used a traditional dissemination approach. They will author a paper based on their research, submit it to a journal or publication, and may make a presentation on the paper in an upcoming conference. These researchers have left knowledge translation of their research really as a task for others to accomplish, and those others being university technology transfer offices or actually serendipity. We have suggested to those grantees and others that they should always begin their projects with their end goal in mind, in effect what they are trying to accomplish. They should always consider translating their research findings for uptake and use by others. There are 6 different stakeholder groups that should be targeted for the translation of research findings. First one is clinicians, practitioners. Second, manufacturing and industry. Third, consumers. Fourth, policymakers. Fifth, brokers. And lastly, other researchers. While you're probably familiar with the stakeholder groups mentioned, I thought it best to define what we mean by a broker stakeholder group. And I noticed on the chat that we had some brokers on the call today. Brokers to us comprise a group of individuals who are intermediaries between knowledge producers and knowledge users. Whereas members of other stakeholder groups can typically instrumentally use the new knowledge themselves, brokers would be helping others to apply it. So brokers could be technology transfer offices, helping to bridge the researcher, the knowledge producer, and the manufacturer, the knowledge user. They could be nurses who instruct a patient who is a knowledge user. They could be disability service providers at a university who are connecting with other university personnel with information to help them better serve students with disabilities. Or they could be independent living advocates who are sharing information with facility owners, knowledge users, to persuade them to change the accessibility of their centers. Next slide. Each stakeholder group needs research findings to be presented in a format in which they are conversant. Each stakeholder group receives research findings through different mediums or venues. A researcher or their surrogate must become conversant in these various methods of knowledge translation. For example, other researchers will look towards journal articles, while consumers will be looking for articles that translate the research into layman's terms in more mainstream reading venues. Industry will be looking at their industry newsletters and publications. For various stakeholder groups, one must learn what type of information is important to that group and in what format they must receive it. We have learned that it is important to know what to say, how to say it, and when to say it when dealing with the various stakeholder groups. However, to answer those questions, you have to know your audience and what motivates them. For example, as a result of your research, if you have developed a new product or invention that you're trying to license to a manufacturer, you have to do your due diligence research on that manufacturer and their industry segment. Who are the companies in that industry segment? How do they introduce new products? What are their product development cycles? What are the trade shows they exhibit at and attend? Do they routinely license products? Will they accept your non-disclosure agreement or confidentiality agreement? Or will you have to sign theirs? Will they accept patented products only for review? What publications do they subscribe to? What are the markup for products in their industry? After you've answered these questions and now know who your audience is, next you have to ascertain what motivates them. If it is a company, are they seeking new products as they are trying to increase their exposure and market share in their industry? Are they an early adopter of new technology, or do they wish to let others test the waters on a new product or technology before finally placing their oar in the water and committing substantial resources to the technology? If this seems to be a lot of work, it is. And that is just for translating your research findings for one stakeholder group, manufacturers and industry. As Greg Vanderheiden, another NIDOR grantee, has stated time and time again, whereas many funding programs exist for carrying out research, there is relatively little funding to move these ideas forward to the point where they are attractive to industry. Technology transfer typically costs more, and often much more, than the innovation itself. Next slide. Just a bit more on knowing what to say. An example, if you will, is on ascertaining what terminology will work in a certain industry. As you can probably tell, most of my knowledge translation efforts deal with translating research findings for industry. As I mentioned, knowing your target audience is of extreme importance. While from an ethical standpoint, we would all like to create products that are universally designed. However, knowing that our target companies are in a very price-competitive market may force us to tailor our expectations. While universal design may be our end goal to make usability and accessibility inroads, we may have to scale back our initial goals. For example, if I'm trying to increase the usability and accessibility of a mainstream product, talking with a company, I will use the term transgenerational design, a term coined by Dr. James Perkle of Syracuse University. Here we speak to companies about market broadening and designing a product with increased usability and accessibility characteristics that will allow the use of a product to span the ages from children to older adults. If I use the term universal design to those companies, the companies immediately think of the need for multiple activation methods for a product, which may be too costly or too much of a risk for a company, and they wouldn't be interested. Transgenerational design, usability and accessibility improvements may be obtained gradually over time as the cost of new activation technology decrease. The bottom line here is you have to know your audience and how not to alienate them by the terminology you may be using. To translate one's research finding for uptake and use by other stakeholder groups, one must invest the time and effort needed to know each of the stakeholder audiences. When translating those research findings, one needs to identify what we call a hook, if you will, something that gets your audience interested, invested, and enthused about your research and your findings. So how do you develop that needed hook? First and foremost, you need to be well-versed in the research findings you are translating, and that is a given for a researcher. Next, as I mentioned earlier, you need to find out what will motivate the stakeholder you are targeting into uptaking the use of the material you are providing. As I mentioned at the beginning of my presentation, on our website we have examples of contextualized knowledge translation packages that were developed for the various stakeholder groups. Each one had a specific hook developed for that specific stakeholder group. We've got translation packages developed for AAC research findings, a wheeled mobility research finding, and for an exercise technology, exercise physiology research finding. Those contextualized packages, CKPs, can be found on our website under Locus Instrument at the website listed on the slide. Each of the CKPs generated in the various research areas clearly define the need, and in effect, why the research was performed, and presented the resultant research as a solution to that need. CKPs were generated with their specific target audiences in mind for all six stakeholder groups and provided the specific information a particular stakeholder group needed to pursue uptake and use of the research findings. Does it work? Yes, it does. Example, we had an AAC manufacturer comment the following when he received a CKP on an AAC research finding we presented. He said the CKP is well written and structured in a way that relates to AAC manufacturers, his stakeholder group. The need is articulated very well. That was why the research was performed. The technology description and the links to the website were helpful in giving a sense of the degree to which these topics have been researched and the breadth of the solution. Again, the solution that the research provided. Okay, so how does one go about writing a contextualized knowledge package or CKP? Well, the first step is to develop a 60-second or less elevator pitch on your research finding. With a 60-second time limit, you'll force yourself to present and make your case for your research findings in a brief, concise manner. An example of an elevator pitch from one of our devices we have transferred is available on our website in the resource section at the link shown on the slide. Before we go further into contextualized knowledge packages or CKP, I mentioned earlier about knowing what to say, how to say it, and when to say it when dealing with the various stakeholders. What we just covered was an example of knowing what to say. Next up is how to say it. As you target the various stakeholder groups, you have to be cognizant of your approach methods. For example, when speaking with a company, you should not say anything negative about the company or its existing products. You want to be perceived as a resource to the company. When approaching consumers, you may wish to incorporate scenarios or examples into your translation that would allow the consumer reader to get a feel for how the research benefits them or others like them directly. As an aside, organizations such as the recently completed AAC RERC actually formed a writers' brigade for the translation of their RERC's research findings. This RERC authored a 160-page manual entitled AAC RERC Writers' Brigade, Knowledge Translation Through a Writer's Workshop, a guide for individuals and organizations. It was written by Johanna Schwartz and Sarah Blackstone as a step-by-step guide describing how to set up a writer's brigade to write and publish articles about research and development activities that are meant to have a positive impact on the lives of individuals with disabilities. This guide systematically explains how to include with people with disabilities in the transfer and translation of research. We have briefly covered what to say, how to say it, and now we are on to when to say it. The stakeholder group you are addressing will dictate when to approach them about their research findings. Depending on the stakeholder group, you have to be aware of conference schedules, meetings, academic breaks, and of course fiscal years and new product introduction times. For manufacturers in a specific industry, you'll have to ascertain when new products are introduced yearly and when corporate product development teams are formed. For example, if you're contacting a company in the wheeled mobility area, you should be aware that there are new product introductions that revolve around MedTrade and the International Seating Symposium. Contacting those companies just prior to those conferences is pointless as they're concentrating on introducing and selling their newly developed products at these shows. If you are contacting a company that exhibits at the Consumer Electronics Show, for example, in January each year, the time to contact that company would be a month or so after the show. Bottom line, contacting any company just prior to their exhibiting at a show doesn't gain you the time or attention you need to make your case for what you are presenting. In the last few minutes, I would like to briefly touch on the development of a CKP for manufacturers. There are 5 key elements in a manufacturer's CKP. They are an executive summary, a background current situation, what's actually happening with the consumer, what they're currently using, a technical section describing the results and the solution of your research, a marketing section which includes intellectual property, and lastly a consumer involvement, testing, and input section. For purposes of brevity, I'll just focus on the executive summary of a manufacturer's CKP during this presentation. The executive summary is going to, for each stakeholder group, will vary based on the stakeholder group and purpose. For manufacturer's CKP, as an example, brief paragraphs could include product need area, why your research was performed, product solutions, your research findings, invention or technology, target market size, who will purchase your product and how many of them are there, a business opportunity for the manufacturer, marketing strategy, intellectual property status, is it patented or can it be patented, who owns what, do you own what you're presenting to the company, consumer information, how were consumers involved in the identification of the need and the development of the solution. In addition, any purchase intent price point information you were able to elicit from consumers during the course of the research should be included. Now, examples of all of those are included on our website with examples of, again, CKPs. In the areas of target market, business opportunity, marketing strategy, intellectual property status, if you are affiliated with a university or some hospital or organization, their technology transfer office will work with you to provide that information. Again, there are samples of CKPs on our website. And just briefly, there's an optional section which we talk about, which is background and current situation. It details the current status and current state of the science. For an invention, details on how the target market is currently addressing or not addressing the need. For an invention, you give details, issues related to the problems associated with the defined need. And it requires a target market interaction, some primary market research involving consumers. Summary. Translating knowledge for benefit of stakeholders is of paramount importance. Learning the method and medium for translating and disseminating new research findings is a necessary step in all research projects. Knowledge translation should be planned and budgeted for by all researchers in their projects. The goal, of course, is to benefit the target population of the research in the first place. We want to make a difference with our work. Please visit the KT for TT website for additional information, more examples, and more resources. With that, I will close and say thank you. Does anyone have any questions on what I presented here today?
Yeah, we have time for a question or two. If anyone had some, go ahead and you could put that in the chat. I know sometimes it's, someone's typing. Sometimes things are so interesting it takes a little bit to absorb them.
Again, hopefully you can go to our website, and it's a pretty detailed website giving a lot of examples and resources that are available.
So Pegnosik is asking, Jim, how does what you presented differ from marketing?
Basically, it is. You're actually marketing to consumers. You're marketing to clinicians. You're marketing to companies. You're finding out what their buttons and hot buttons are and how they want material given to them. You're marketing it to consumers. You're taking your research findings that you may have published in a journal and translating for something that can be placed in an everyday magazine that a consumer can pick up in layman's terms and understand what the research is. So it is a great deal of marketing, but it's marketing to different stakeholder groups.